You're listening to episode 2 of the Stronger by Science podcast, in which Greg Nuckols tells us about his recent study comparing fatigue and recovery rates between males and females. We've also got an interview with Dr. Jason Cholewa, who is a professor at Coastal Carolina University. And we spoke with Jason about betaine supplementation, the state of research in exercise science, and the state of higher education as a whole. Now, before we begin, I have a little announcement. We recently spent months revamping the online coaching program at Stronger by Science, and we're finally able to open up some one-on-one coaching spots. We are running a one-week sale starting today, May 30th. We've got a really talented coaching staff, and I am stoked that our new and improved coaching service is ready to roll. So, if you've been thinking about signing up with a Stronger by Science coach, now would be the time to do it because the sale ends on June 6th. And finally, the first few minutes of this episode has some spoilers for Avengers Endgame and for the final season of Game of Thrones. So if you want to avoid those spoilers, just look at the timestamps in the episode description and you can skip ahead to the segment called Feats of Strength. All right, that's enough announcements. Enjoy episode 2. Welcome. If you are listening to this, that means two things. You made it past our very unlikable, sarcastic sense of humor in episode 1 and decided to try another. It also means that you've forgiven Greg for his last-minute misogyny at the end of episode 1. He apologized to me and his family profusely for that.
Or they just didn't listen to episode 1.
Or they just didn't listen. Yeah,
which, all things considered, is most likely.
That is the highest likelihood. So anyway, we're glad to have you for episode 2. And this is quite a momentous day for the Stronger by Science family because I have the opportunity. By the way, I'm Eric Trexler, your host. I have the opportunity.
We're off to a smashing start so far.
I have the opportunity, the honor, to be the first person to present Master Greg Nuckols. Now, Greg defended his master's thesis yesterday successfully. And he's always been a master to me because that's just his management style. But now it's official. So Greg is still a temporary host, still on his kind of probationary period. He made some big mistakes episode 1, but we're going to give it another shot. But Greg, welcome.
Thank you. I don't have the degree yet, do I?
You do not.
Yeah, I don't know how that works.
I can fill you in.
You're being a little intemperate here.
Well, it's kind of like if you're a knight, you can make other people a knight. Because I have a PhD, I can kind of make anybody a master, I think.
I'm the Brienne in this situation.
Is that a spoil? Do we have to spoiler alert that?
I don't think so. I mean,
okay.
It's been like a week and a half.
And this will be up in a couple weeks anyway.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I was going to say that, but I was like, let me generalize that situation.
Fair enough.
That's a Game of Thrones reference if you're listening and have no idea what we're talking about. But anyway, so what happens is when you've completed all of the degree, like for a PhD, except your dissertation defense, then you're ABD. I don't think there's an equivalent for that with the master's unless for some reason you did the whole degree and were delayed on the defense part. Mm-hmm. Which that actually does happen now that I think of it. So you're kind of like all but dissertation or all but thesis or whatever. Then after you're there, so you've done all the requirements of the degree and you've defended whatever thesis or dissertation you're doing, then you're called a graduand, like A-N-D at the end. And so it's not a graduate, but it basically means you did everything you're supposed to do, but graduation day hasn't come yet.
I see.
So I the only reason I know that is because I had to send out some manuscripts and like sign cover letters in that little waiting period. And I was like, who am I? And that's who you are right now. You are a graduand of a master's program.
I'll take it.
So, and then once the degree comes in the mail, it'll be official. So
then I will be a master of arts.
You will be an artistic master, yes. That's a weird thing about our masters is that it's a master of arts, not a master of science.
Yeah, so for people listening, if you've ever looked at Eric's CV and you see that it's MA, PhD, and mine will soon be MA as well. The reason why the exercise physiology program at UNC is a Master of Arts and not a Master of Science is we don't actually take that many classes. And I think the way the university determines whether something's a MA or an MS is how many science classes you have to take, like, for the actual degree program. And so UNC is fairly light on the academics to give the students more time to be in the lab and actually do science. So ironically, like, it's a Master of Arts so we can actually do more science.
Yeah, and of everyone I talked to, no one has cared yet that I'm not a real scientist.
Cool.
I've got I actually have a bachelor's in education, a master's in art, and then my doctorate is in philosophy, obviously.
Yeah.
A PhD. That's what the PH stands for. So I haven't figured out science yet. I haven't cracked that nut.
Academia is weird.
It is a strange place with a lot of very elaborate robes and hats. Yeah. Now, how do you feel? Different now that you're almost a master?
Not really.
Other than that, you're doing good?
Yeah.
Did you like Avengers the other night? We went out with a big group of people and saw it. It must have been like kind of opening night, right?
Opening night we saw it like 5 days after opening.
God, it was still really crowded.
Yeah. So also for people listening, Eric came and saw Avengers with us. He had not seen any MCU movie up to this point. So I imagine he was very confused, but you know, there was like some stuff that would make more sense if you knew the characters better, but like most of the cool parts are just the action scenes anyways.
Yeah, I had a good time, but it's kind of like if you go to Jaws 2 and you're sitting there and it's like, oh, I didn't see Jaws 1. Somebody can nudge you and be like, dude, really big shark.
Yeah.
Like, huge shark.
Just to fill you in, the shark is the bad guy here.
Right. So with this one, it's like, instead of not seeing the first one, I haven't seen the first, like, 16.
22.
22? That's even worse. And so at the beginning, my girlfriend was kind of nudging me and trying to give me backstories as we went. And I kind of just called her off and was like, there's really no point here. Because, like, the superhero backstories are insane. It's always like, so here's the thing. He can fly at night, but not during the day. His main thing is he's lactose intolerant. That's going to be big when they have a scene in like the cheese processing plant. And he also got his heart broken. And that's like his whole thing is he's trying to avenge that.
Yeah.
Every single character had like a 30-page backstory. So I just, you know.
I mean, really all you need to know is Purple Man bad.
Yeah, I picked up on that. Yeah. Very, very bad. Very bad man. But no, it was good.
I thought it was good. I actually preferred Infinity War, if I'm being honest, which you haven't seen. So
that doesn't mean I don't have an opinion.
That means nothing to you. Fair enough. Yeah, I don't know. I felt like I like shows with stakes, and it felt just very like happily ever after type deal. Like there were some, so not to spoil it, but like there were some key characters that died. But if you've been following Marvel movies, like even if you didn't know the plot of Endgame, you knew those characters were going to die because their contracts with Marvel Studios were up. And they were like, no, I want to go act in different things and like broaden the base of projects I work on. It's like, you already knew who was going to die.
Not me. I was on the edge of my seat.
Fair enough.
Didn't care, but I was still on the edge of my seat.
Anyway, I thought it was good. I thought that Season 8, Episode 3 of Game of Thrones was better, though.
Yeah, that was pretty crazy.
Yeah. We saw those on back-to-back nights. And I think if I would have seen Endgame with that Game of Thrones episode not fresh in my mind, I would have been like, whoa, this is awesome. But it kind of paled in comparison, if I'm being honest.
I agree. And we also had somebody over for that Game of Thrones episode that had never seen, I guess he had seen one Game of Thrones episode before that.
And it was only the prior episode that was all exposition.
Yeah, so he was as lost as I was during Avengers, but I think we both had a good time anyway.
Yeah.
Now, we haven't done this segment yet, but I think this is a perfect week to do it. The segment is called Feats of Strength, and we had a couple big ones this week, and you brought both of these to my attention, so I'm going to let you have the honors here.
Yeah, so if you're listening and you follow powerlifting, you probably know about both of these already. But if you don't, buddy, they're crazy. So John Haack recently totaled 1962 at 181. That was via a 677 squat, 501 bench, and 782 deadlift. To the best of my knowledge, John is still drug-free. And if that's the case, that makes this even crazier. And even if it's not, I don't care, because it's still an absolutely ridiculous total. So for my money, the previous most impressive raw total of all time probably was Jesse Norris's 2033 at 198. And so to be, basically 70 pounds off that in the next weight class down, that's wild. Like, I honestly think that in terms of like male raw powerlifting, that may be the most impressive total of all time for my money.
Yeah. And like, to your point, you mentioned like drug or no drug, you don't really care.
No.
The only thing, because I've competed at 181.
Yeah.
The only thing you could do to make me total that would be if you did like a singularity thing and just merged my skeleton with a forklift or something. Like there's no amount of drugs and wishful thinking on the planet,
Yeah. So it was, this was pretty humbling for me, because like I'm a reasonably good powerlifter, and my ultimate goal in the sport is I'd really like to total 2,000 at 220 and potentially 2,100 at 242. And like I said, like I'm not a scrub powerlifter.
Not at all.
And I'm basically aiming to do what John just did, but 2 weight classes higher. and those would be numbers that I'd feel like, okay, I can die happy now.
Yeah.
Dude's just on another level. Like that's a ridiculous total.
I had that kind of number in my head. We both have the detriment or the privilege of having gotten into the sport before all the strong people did.
True.
My thing that I really wanted to do, and this is embarrassing in hindsight, I was going to be thrilled to squat 500 at 181. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that'd be a really nice number for me.
Yeah, that's something people miss, though. Like, back in the day, if you were sub 200 and you had a 500 squat, people were like, oh, that's a strong dude.
No, like, when I did that at the state meet in Ohio in 2012, I was like, I kind of puffed my chest out walking down the hallway.
Yeah.
And people were like, oh, that guy had a hell of a squat. He squatted 677. He benched 501.
Yeah.
Like, that's really, really scary.
Yeah, a 500 squat at 181 these days is probably good for like 30th place at nationals.
Yeah, it is not good.
But and then the other one, which I thought this one was even more ridiculous, but Marianna Gasparyan squatted 573, so that's 260 kilos at 123, that was raw with knee wraps. Marianna is not a tested athlete. I would be shocked to find out if she were drug free. But again, that does not matter to me one iota, because that's a ridiculous number. That's 4.7 times body weight, and it's actually like 20 pounds over the male world record in that weight class, which I don't think that's literally ever happened in any strength sport ever.
Yeah.
And equally impressive, it's not just the squat. Both her and Steffi Cohen broke both the men's and women's world record for the total in that weight class as well this past weekend. But just that squat, man, like that's an outrageous squat.
Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. And we were just kind of going over those total records. And I think you said 4 of the top 6 in that weight class for untested federations were women?
Across all federations.
Across all federations. Yeah. Okay.
And I mean, I'm sure a big chunk of that is there just aren't that many men who weigh 123.
That are tested. Yeah.
Tested or untested.
Yeah. But especially untested.
But still, like, even so, just the fact that there are men who compete in that weight class, in general, like, the sex difference in strength is so large that no matter how good a female lifter is, she may be better than the vast majority of men in the world, but typically there's a pretty big gulf between the top men and the top women in any weight class. So we mentioned John Haack at 181 earlier. The most impressive untested woman in that class is Shakira Ingram, formerly Shakira Holcomb. And she's absurdly strong. Like, I don't want to downplay this at all. Like, she's an unbelievably impressive lifter. She totals close to 1,600 at 181 untested, which, like, that would be...
That's a lot of weight.
Yeah, and that would be a very, very competitive men's total in that weight class. But, you know, Haack is out totaling her by close to 400 pounds.
Yeah.
So for Marianna and Steffi to both break the men's world record at 123, regardless of the fact that there aren't that many men at 123, like, that's still absurdly impressive.
Yeah, it's crazy. And you mentioned, you know, those strength differences between men and women. Is that something you know a little thing about?
One or two things. So
I mentioned Greg defended his thesis yesterday, and I was there in the flesh. I thought he did a great job. I took notes. So we'd like to discuss that a little bit while it's fresh on the mind. So, sure. Greg, can you tell the listeners kind of the topic first?
Yeah, so I was looking at fatigability and recovery rates between men and women.
Right, and you know, I thought your presentation was awesome. You started out by kind of highlighting some of the differences between men and women when it comes to both fatigue and recovery from strength training, and strength in general. I think you mentioned as well. Do you mind going over some of those for us?
Yeah. So the relevant physiological differences when it comes to fatigue rate is women, on average, tend to have a higher proportion of type 1 muscle fibers. It's hard to know how relevant that actually is. I'm not aware of research saying that, like, you know, if you have a 10% greater relative abundance of type 1 fibers, you will be X% less fatigable. But type 1 fibers are a little less fatigable than type 2 fibers, so that is a physiological difference whereby one would expect women to be less fatigable. On top of the fiber type differences, due to the effects of estrogen primarily, women have different patterns of substrate utilization. So at any relative exercise intensity, women have a slightly lower reliance on anaerobic metabolism and a slightly lower reliance on glucose metabolism, which means, like, you're going to burn through glycogen a little more slowly. You don't accumulate lactate and metabolic waste quite as quickly, etc. So that's a relevant difference. And the final thing, which prior to this study I thought may have been the most important thing, was just women have smaller muscles than men. Again, not in all cases, but on average. And one of the things that occurs when you're contracting your muscles pretty hard is they increase. Like, if you flex your bicep, it increases in circumference, like the muscle itself. And so that's going to put pressure on the blood vessels that run through the muscle. And so larger muscles are going to put a greater occlusive pressure on veins and arteries, which could limit oxygen delivery and waste clearance. And so the thinking there being, okay, women have slightly smaller muscles. They're going to have to be using their muscles harder to exert the same amount of occlusive pressure on their blood vessels. So just oxygen delivery, waste clearance may be a little bit more efficient. In terms of differences that may be relevant for recovery, again, it probably mostly comes down to sex hormones. So estrogen helps to stabilize the sarcolemma and decreases macrophage infiltration of damaged tissue a little bit. If that sounds like complete gobbledygook. Essentially what it does is it helps prevent some degree of muscle damage. Like, muscle damage still occurs, but after a given relative stimulus, women will have a little bit less like disruption of the actual muscle fibers themselves. And limiting macrophage infiltration, that essentially means less swelling, less edema, less inflammation within the muscle. So it should recover a little bit quicker, and not have like greater secondary damage due to like a very large inflammatory response. And then as far as recovery goes, estrogen helps with basically like all stages of the life cycle of satellite cells. So activation, differentiation, proliferation, and then donation of myonuclei to the muscle fibers. So that should improve recovery, but also testosterone does the exact same thing. So it's hard to really say that that's a sex difference. Like, it's a sex difference that women have more estrogen, but men also have a sex hormone that's doing all of the same stuff. Yeah. So yeah, those are most of the key physiological differences that would lead one to expect that there might be differences in fatigue and recovery.
Yeah, and I like how you say would lead one to expect that there'd be a difference, because the worst kept secret in exercise science is that we basically built an entire body of literature only studying men, right?
Yeah.
And so now there's a lot of interest in saying, what about the other half of humans?
Yeah.
You know, do these things really generalize? And so now there's a lot more effort being put toward venturing into essentially building a new literature from scratch, you know?
Well, not necessarily building a new literature from scratch, but kind of seeing how much we know about men does actually generalize to women.
Right. And so one of the things I've always pushed for the idea that there are several really pressing research questions where there's very obvious reasons to say, I'm not sure, you know, what we've been generalizing from men to women. I think there's good reason to think that that's not a safe generalization. And so I've kind of gotten into arguments where it's we need more of this female research, but we need to prioritize what's done in terms of like, do we have a strong rationale for why there would be a difference? Yeah. And I think it's very lazy to say, well, it was all done in men, so let's just do like one-to-one replications of every study out there. Like, that would be essentially rebuilding a literature from scratch.
Yeah.
But I think in the short term, it's really important to do a targeted approach to like, what are the most realistic, you know, pressing research questions where we think there would be a difference, and kind of attack those first before we start building out from there.
For sure.
So I think this is one of those really solid research questions where, as you've just discussed, there's a very strong foundation for why a person would expect that fatigue and recovery are different in men versus women. There are mechanisms that would underlie such a difference, but now it's time to actually do the research and find that out. So in your literature review, were there any like really big gaps that you saw that kind of reaffirmed your idea that like, yeah, this is the study that needs to be done now?
So as far as fatigability stuff goes, the biggest gap is just there are actually a lot of studies there, but most of them use protocols or measures that wouldn't really be relevant to most athletes or coaches. So like probably a solid 80% of that research just uses isometric exercise, which is good for being able to tease out mechanisms because the muscle's just there in place doing a contraction against an immovable force, basically.
So isometric meaning that the muscle length doesn't really change during the contraction. Yeah. So like doing a wall sit or just kind of stationary like flexing of a muscle would be an isometric.
So yeah, that stuff is interesting, but it's hard to know how well that's going to actually port over to, you know, doing something like squat or bench press or 90% of the exercises we would do in the gym. The isometric literature indicates that women are less fatigable than men, but again, it's hard to know how well that'll actually generalize to like normal training. Then of the research that does actually use dynamic resistance exercise, it's a lot of the models they use don't reflect what I think a lot of people care about in practice when they think fatigability. So the most common ways that people will go about addressing the question is like, just take one set to failure at a given percentage of 1 rep max and see like, okay, like strength endurance, can men or women do more reps at 70% of their max over one set? Most of that research finds that there's not much of a difference, but also I don't think that that's the type of stuff most people care about. They're more interested in like, when I'm prescribing volume over an entire session for a male lifter versus a female lifter, should I expect to need to prescribe more volume for the man versus the woman? And then probably the second most common experimental approach is just to like do 3 sets to failure or something and see total reps completed over
each set going to failure.
Correct. Which again, that kind of resembles like a traditional bodybuilding approach, but that's not the way most strength athletes would train. Most of the time, you're not going to be taking literally every set to failure. So it's hard to know how well that generalizes as well. So yeah, as far as fatigability goes, there's a fair amount of research, but it's hard to know how applicable most of it is. And then for recovery, most of the research that exists only uses eccentric exercise. There's a good reason for that. So if you're just trying to induce muscle damage in a lab setting, eccentric exercise causes way, way more muscle damage than concentric. So that's the reason it's used most frequently. But the problem with that is that literature is probably biased against women. So most people know this, but your muscles can produce more force eccentrically than concentrically. And the eccentric to concentric strength ratio on average is higher for women than men. So if you're doing something like, like sets of 10 at 80% maximum eccentric force or something like that, that may be, around 1 rep max force for men, but it may be like 120% of 1 rep max force for women, because they have a higher eccentric to concentric strength ratio. And yeah, like, again, you have ecological validity issues because that's just not how most people typically train. Yeah. Just only doing eccentrics.
And just for context, eccentrics are when you're loading the muscle as it's lengthening.
Correct.
So basically doing like negatives.
Yeah,
or something
like a
that.
Heavy negative.
So yeah, a lot of this literature is, isometric or eccentric only, which close to nobody is really training that way.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then of the research that uses like normal dynamic exercises, like the type of stuff we would typically do in the gym, most studies just don't look at performance outcomes, and the ones that do, if they're monitoring recovery of strength, tend to just use isometric measures or just look at an isolated muscle. So, have people do squats and then see, how is their knee extension strength changing over the next 3 days, instead of like, how is their squat performance changing over the next 3 days as they recover. So yeah, with the fatigue stuff, generally the experimental protocols don't look the way most people train. And with the fatigue stuff, the actual protocols they use tend to be a little more similar to how most people would typically train. But the things they're looking at to assess recovery generally aren't the type of stuff that most athletes or coaches would care about. So what I was aiming to do with my study wasn't necessarily to, be the first person to look at male versus female fatigue and recovery, but to do so with an experimental model and recovery assessments that are the type of things that most people listening to this would actually care about.
Right, yeah. So it's one of the great things about, you've probably seen this as well, there's a lot more people I see that are really into lifting, that have spent years and years and years under the bar, that are getting into research and kind of higher education in the field. Mm-hmm. And I think the more we see that, I would speculate there's going to be more people like you who come along and say, we can still answer this research question and maintain some of the ecological validity.
Yeah.
The more we have people that care about the ecological validity, I think the more we're going to see those types of designs.
We were talking about this yesterday. I don't think it would be the worst idea in the world if there was like a stipulation where, before you before you do like performance type research, at least get a couple people strong. Like show that you understand the actual stuff, that like the people who are going to be applying the science well enough that you can do science that will actually affect practice in some way.
Yeah.
Or like, you know, if you're going to do like weight loss stuff in like the sports nutrition space, at least like get someone shredded.
Right.
Like show you understand that world well enough to do research that's going to be relevant to it. And so like if you're purely just doing research for other scientists and just looking at like pure physiology stuff, yeah, whatever, it doesn't matter. But if you're doing research that you like want it to be useful for practitioners, do some practitioner stuff to understand like what would actually be useful to you if you were in that world.
Or get a practitioner involved.
Yeah, or
at the
that
design level.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we always talk about like bridging the gap between science and application, but there's not a lot of people who actually like crossing that bridge and getting the other side involved.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I knew a great scientist. His name's Eric Sobolewski. I lived with him actually, and we had a prowler in our living room. He just had this gift where he would accumulate strength training equipment. It just followed him around. He had like a storage unit full of like squat rack pieces and prowlers and stuff. Mm-hmm. But he told me, the quote I'll never forget is, if you can't measure it in pounds, it's not worth measuring. He also told me that if he ever started a lab, he would have like a special quotient he would calculate that would include a potential student's powerlifting total and their GRE score, because he didn't want people that were either too weak or too smart. So he kind of had this like Goldilocks zone in the middle that compared their strength and their standardized testing scores.
I feel like that might be taking it a shade too far, but it's
mostly joking, but
it's got the right spirit.
It's got the right spirit. Yeah. So you mentioned like you're not the first person who's thought, what if we compared the sexes in fatigue or recovery? But as you've kind of alluded to, the devil's really in the details in terms of how the study is put together and what the methods look like. So can you give us kind of the very brief description of how you went about answering that question?
Yeah, so each participant came 6 times. First visit was just baseline testing, fill out some questionnaires, get a DEXA scan. Arm lean mass was the primary thing I cared about from the DEXA. And then at the end of the session, just work up to a 1 rep max. And while working up to a 1 rep max, we got a load velocity profile. And we got that so we could then subsequently estimate 1 rep maxes. So essentially what we did is we did sets of 3 at 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and 80%, recorded the fastest rep of each set. And then from there, that load velocity profile, so if you graph like x-axis is % 1 rep max, y-axis is mean concentric velocity, the relationship there is going to be like stunningly linear. The average R value in my study was like 0.993, which is
and that's on a scale from 0 to 1.
Correct.
So
that's
high.
That's quite good. And so then when you work someone up to a 1 rep max, you see how fast they move the bar at 1 rep max. And so from then on, essentially what you can do is you only have to work someone up to 80%. You plot their load velocity profile as they're working up to 80%. And then you can extrapolate that trend line down to the velocity that they move 1 rep max loads and get a pretty accurate estimation of their 1 rep max. Reason we did that was for monitoring recovery because, you know, I didn't want to just have people bench press and then test isolated elbow extension strength on a dynamometer. Like I wanted to have an idea of like, okay, like how are people's actual bench presses recovering? But obviously I don't want to put someone through a fatigue protocol, take them to failure, and then immediately after say, all right, we're going to max again. And tomorrow you're going to max again. Day after that, you're going to max again. And day after that, you're going to max again as well.
Yeah.
I didn't want the recovery assessments to basically turn into the Bulgarian method, is what I'm saying. And that's both for participant safety and also to make sure I'm getting good data. Because if I want to see how people are recovering from a fatigue protocol, I don't want the testing of recovery to induce a lot of additional fatigue, which would then cloud the assessment.
Probably would have found no one ever recovers under any circumstance.
Correct.
If that was your protocol.
Yeah. We see after a fatigue protocol, you're weaker the next day. What do you know? You're even weaker the day after that.
Right.
3 days post, 40% of people are injured and no one recovers.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And because you have no actual weight training experience, you would then conclude in the literature, apparently no one's ever recovered from a training session before.
Yeah. True.
Yeah.
Lifting is a hazard to society.
Yes.
Anyway, so that's what the load velocity profiles were for. And so then in session 2, same stuff as session 1, but no DEXA, no questionnaires. They just came in, worked up to a 1 rep max, got load velocity on the way up. And then 5 minutes after they hit their max, strip it down to 75% of their max and just have 1 set to failure. The reason for that is to see how well just single set strength endurance could predict fatigability over something that simulates an entire training session. So the fatigue protocol itself was on session 3. So to start with, work people up to 80%, get their load velocity profile, then go back down to 75% and do sets of 5 with 90 seconds between sets, just until someone reached the point of failure. So set of 5, rest 90 seconds from the time they rack the bar to the time they unrack it again. Set of 5, rest 90 seconds, etc. Then got blood lactate pre and post, and 10 minutes after they failed during the fatigue protocol, just get their load velocity profile again to see how much they've very, very acutely fatigued. Then days 4 through 6, very straightforward. Come in, work them up to 80% load velocity profile, and then gave them questionnaires to assess soreness and sleep the previous night. So just asking, how long did you sleep? Subjectively, how was your sleep quality? And then how sore are your pecs, triceps, and front delts on a scale from 1 to 100, basically. And that was that.
Awesome. Now, and you also took a lot of like background demographic information as well, right? Just to make sure you had all your bases covered.
Yeah, so the questionnaires themselves were asking about sleep stuff. So we used the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Inventory Index, whatever, PSQI. And for stress, we use the Perceived Stress Questionnaire, both of which are validated questionnaires to get an idea of both the quantity and quality of someone's sleep, and then how stressed someone perceives that they are, basically. And then I had another questionnaire I made that was just looking at training background. So it asked how long you've been lifting in general, how long you've been bench pressing, how many sets of bench press per week do you do, how many times per week do you bench press, what proportion of your sets of bench press are fewer than 5 reps, what proportion are between 5 and 15 reps, what proportion are greater than 15 reps, how long you rest between sets of bench press, and what your general training goal is for the bench press. Is it primarily to build muscle, gain strength, or to improve strength endurance?
Yeah, and looking at that questionnaire, I think that's where it really showed that you are a person with experience in the area, where you're using that to inform, what you're looking for in the study, or at least what you've thought to account for.
Yeah, because if 2 people have 3 years of training experience and, one person is like me, and I'm doing like a lot of heavy triples with 5 minutes between sets, and someone else is doing sets of 12 with 60 seconds between sets.
So they're like me.
Yeah. Like we may have like the same years of training experience, but the actual adaptations that would lead to probably considerably different.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wanted to see if the way people habitually trained would affect their fatigability or how well they recovered from training.
Yeah. And speaking of which, you did end up with a pretty well trained and pretty strong sample, right?
Yeah. So average years of training experience was like 7.2 for men, 6.2 for women. The men did have a little bit more experience with the bench press itself. Basically, men for the most part, started benching day one in the gym, which is very unsurprising.
Yeah.
Most of the women had about 2 years of resistance training experience before they touched the bench press. So they'd been benching about 4.5 years on average. But yeah, pretty well trained. I checked their IPF scores to see whether like the male and female samples would be similarly competitive in the actual context of powerlifting, because like that's what I care about.
I can say very confidently without doing any searching, you're the first person to do that.
No, people use Wilks scores a fair amount.
What? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. This may be the first one with IPF points.
Yeah, because the IPF thing's new, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Wilks, if I would have used Wilks, the results would have been the same.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, so the average IPF points for the men were like 434, using like the bench press specific formula. And for the women was like 460. Mm-hmm. So very, very similar. And just to contextualize that, like what the IPF formula does is it basically crams everything into a normal distribution, also accounting for weight and sex, such that the mean of the distribution is 500 and a standard deviation is 100. So with IPF points in the mid 400s, essentially the people in my sample were not as good of benchers as the average competitive powerlifter, which I wouldn't expect them to be, but they were mostly within one standard deviation. So they would have been at home at a powerlifting meet, but not particularly great powerlifters.
Yeah.
So pretty good. Average male bench was like 230. Average female bench was not quite 135. Like for the last participant, it was like 2 pounds under 135. So I was hoping that she was going to be like super strong and pull the average above 135, just because I think that would be cool. Because the men did crack the 2 plate barrier, but she wasn't super jacked. So
yeah,
it was like 129 or something.
Yeah,
but you know, that's pretty good.
Yeah. So I've had the privilege of actually seeing under the hood a little bit when it comes to the results and the data, which I'm sworn to secrecy on. But I by the way, never would have imagined as an 18-year-old kid who's like, oh, maybe I'll study exercise science, that we'd find ourselves in a place where we get to like run studies and actually like handle data and stuff. Like I still, it never gets old to me that we can like do cool studies we care about and actually be that person a few years later where you're just hanging out with your friends, like looking at your data. Like, that's pretty crazy.
I agree.
Now, can you give us a rundown of basically the key findings? I mean, I just listened to you talk for like 40 minutes yesterday about results alone. So I assume you don't want to share all of it, but the key findings in your mind.
So during the fatigue protocol, women got way more reps, like basically twice as many. And
that's doing the repeated sets of 5 until they fail.
Correct.
Basically.
So total reps completed during the fatigue protocol. It was like somewhere around 30 for men, somewhere around 60 for women. So big difference. Recovery, so assessing recovery via predicted 1 rep max and soreness of the pecs, triceps, and front delts. Recovery assessments were all similar between sexes. So in spite of the women doing way, like almost twice as many sets, they recovered at essentially the same rate as the men did. And that was actually what I hypothesized. And in terms of like non-significant differences, which whatever, like do with that what you will, the women like 24 hours post-training were a little more sore than the men, but that wasn't a significant difference. But their decrease in predicted 1 rep max 24 hours post was actually a little smaller than it was for the men. So like strength recovery actually may have been slightly better for the women, but soreness may have also been slightly greater for the women. But again, like those differences weren't significant, so don't like go posting around the internet like, oh, Greg said this, he has research to prove it. Like, No, that's dumb. And then all of the various things we looked at to see if, if like sleep would affect any of this stuff, or stress, or training background. Pretty much nothing was predictive of anything. So for soreness, 24 hours post-training, the men who got more reps during the fatigue protocol tended to be sorer than the men who got fewer reps during the fatigue protocol. That relationship did not exist for women. Basically, like, one person got 24 sets, and the fewest number of sets someone got was 3. So, like, big range there, but that wasn't predictive of how sore people got at all, which I thought was interesting. And the only other factor, as far as fatigue goes, the only factor where when you put it in a model also accounting for sex, that also significantly contributed to predicting how many reps people would get during the fatigue protocol was bench press sets per week. So like training volume, such that when even accounting for sex, people with higher training volume tended to get more sets during the fatigue protocol. I think that's reasonably intuitive.
Yeah.
Other than that, though, how long someone had been training, like how good of a bencher they were, like IPF points, what their training looked like, wasn't predictive of how fatigable they were or how well they would recover, which I personally thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah. So, we kind of started this conversation talking about how you approached it from a very applied kind of perspective, viewing the research question, but setting up the study with a lot of ecological validity that theoretically should facilitate application of the findings. So what do you think are kind of the applicable takeaways for somebody who wants to use this to inform their training moving forward?
It's hard to say. The reason it's hard to say is, so essentially when you run a study, you have to come up with a protocol that you think is going to do a good job of testing whatever it is you want to test. For some things, the validity thereof and the generalizability is very obvious. So if you want to know how strong someone's bench press is, you work them up to a max. That's how strong they are on the bench press. Like, that's not really a debatable thing. When you're dealing with a construct like fatigability, I think my protocol did a pretty good job of assessing that. But, the protocol is what it is. And so the actual magnitude of the findings we know applies to the bench press using the protocol that I used. But, if variables were manipulated, so if we used a weight other than 75%, or if we used different rest intervals, or if we used a different exercise, results may have been different. So I feel pretty good saying that for upper body exercise, if men and women do submaximal sets with similar rest time between sets, women are probably going to be able to do more sets than men and recover at a similar rate. As far as the recovery stuff goes, my findings actually contrast with a recent study by Davies et al. That had men and women do 5 sets of 5 squats at 80% and then 1 set to failure, and found that for some measures, men actually recovered a little faster than women, looking at counter movement jump height and concentric knee extension strength. So it could be that maybe women recover at the same rate or for a given level of volume slightly faster for upper body, but maybe men recover a little faster lower body. Davies' study was quite ecologically valid as well. I wish they would have actually assessed squat strength recovery instead of knee extension strength. But overall, that was quite a solid study. So yeah, we need more work to flesh out some of those details. But I feel good saying, at least for the bench press and probably upper body exercise in general, women can probably do more volume, or at minimum, men need longer rest periods between sets. Those I think would be the 2 solid takeaways that I feel the best about. And then if you wanted to generalize a little bit more, I do think women on average are a little less fatigable than men. But that would be a pretty big generalization just from my study specifically. I do think when you look at the entire context of the literature, you can support that. But I wouldn't draw something that broad just from my one study.
Yeah. And luckily, people are going to get their own opportunity to interpret your work, right? I mean,
yeah.
What are you planning to do with it moving forward?
We'll get it published. I'm hoping...
In a prestigious academic journal?
Probably not. I mean, so I'm not aiming for like MSSE or something like that. I'd really like to get it published in PeerJ. Like that's my number one choice. Reasons being, I really support the open science movement.
Yeah. And you've put your name behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, so I definitely want it to be open access. I don't want it to be in a journal that generally isn't open access, but like, you know, will publish an open access article from time to time. Like, I want to support a journal that does specifically, you know, throw its weight behind the open access movement. And PeerJ is good, and its publication cost is lower than some of the other options. And they publish good stuff. So that's my first choice. But then, like, another reason I like PeerJ is they say you can talk about your results and share them literally however you want. It has a Creative Commons BY 4.0 license, which basically says, you know, your results are completely in the public domain. As long as someone gives you credit, they can use it however they want. And like, I think that's how science should be. So if PeerJ will take it, that will also mean that I can do a thorough write-up for the site without like Elsevier trying to sue me.
Isn't that the damnedest thing?
Yeah.
Suing you for writing about your own work?
Yeah.
And so when you say the site, that would be
strongerbyscience.com.
Yeah. So hopefully someday in the near future, you'll be able to get a thorough write-up, and that'll give Greg... you must have spent some long nights doing all those kind of additional exploratory analyses that were quite informative, but, you know, may or may not make it into, you know, the peer-reviewed manuscript.
Yeah.
So that would be a good kind of avenue that you could still pursue those things and get them out there.
Yeah, for sure.
So time flies, but it looks like it's just about time to play us out here.
All right.
Now, to play us out, I was going to hit you with a very generic but very timely question. So, the whole bodybuilding strength world, it used to be a world of mythology. Mm-hmm. It was just oral traditions handed down from generations of strong people. And in the last probably 10, 15, maybe 20 years, there's been this push of taking a more evidence-based approach to how we train, how we eat, things like that. And I think an extension of that is there are more people who really like fitness who are getting into higher academic programs. So pursuing a bachelor's, even a master's, sometimes even a PhD in the field. So the day after kind of finishing your master's, when you look back at it, for someone who, you know, maybe they're about to start college, or maybe they just finished a different bachelor's degree and they are thinking about pursuing a master's in the field. What kind of advice would you give someone in that position?
Oof. Biggest piece of advice would be to not do what I did. A master's program shouldn't just consume your entire life. But if you're trying to get a master's while also trying to run two businesses, it probably will. So I do think... I think a good time to get a master's would be fresh out of undergrad. Or if you want to work for a couple years, get a job that it wouldn't kill you to walk away from for like while you're in grad school. The path I took is not one that I would recommend. And then just in general, if you want to pursue it, like there are several careers where if you don't have at least a master's, you're going to have a tough time. So these days, like strength and conditioning, not so much private sector, I don't think, but especially if you want to work for a college or a professional organization, most of them are looking for a master's degree. So like if that's something you think you want to do, you definitely need to go to grad school for it. If you're... This is kind of out of left field, but one thing I would say is I think it's important to distinguish science as an instrument from the state of the literature in the field as it currently is. As Eric alluded to, there's a lot of really good research that is getting published from people who either have some experience coaching or, work closely with coaches and generally know what they're doing. So they're putting out research that's going to be applicable for practitioners. Back in the day, there was like the stereotype that, scientists are just nerds and like pencil neck nerds in lab coats that don't know anything. And like that is probably true in some cases, but there are absolutely people who understand strength and conditioning well enough that they're publishing very good, very applicable research. So I wouldn't want you to be dissuaded just by that negative stereotype and think like, a lot of the literature doesn't seem to be all that useful and relevant, therefore this isn't the place for me. If you find a good advisor who will kind of let you take your applied knowledge and do good work with it, science is absolutely an instrument that is flexible enough to allow you to do research that is going to give people a lot of benefit and utility. And then in terms of whether you particularly should do it, I guess it kind of depends on what you want to do in the industry. If you want to be a professor, like, you need to, obviously.
Right.
If you kind of want to do, like, if you just want to be like a personal trainer or like a strength coach at a private facility, I don't think it's the worst idea to get a master's, but a PhD would be overkill. And I think the value of a master's is that you learn information in undergrad, but you don't learn that much about the actual scientific process and how it all works. And I think that if you're someone who cares about science and like the quote unquote evidence-based approach to training people and whatnot, or just training yourself, you do get more of like a depth of understanding of science if you have actually done it, versus like the idiots who just read PubMed abstracts and think they know anything about anything. So I think that will help give you a little bit more depth there.
Can I give a quick quote in that regard?
Sure.
I don't mean to derail you, but
yeah.
When I was applying for master's programs out of undergrad, I asked for a recommendation letter from somebody. And I was a good undergrad student. I mean, I would obsess over the material and get it and then give it back on exams. And he said, I know you're a very good undergrad student, but that doesn't mean you're going to be a very good grad student.
Yeah. Because
when you go from undergrad to graduate work, you transition from being an information consumer to someone who synthesizes and hopefully produces new information. And so he said, never forget that what you're doing is a complete transition.
Yeah.
This is not an extension of undergrad.
Yeah.
It's exactly what you've alluded to. The idea of looking at current research and synthesizing new ideas from it, or even creating your own original research from scratch, I mean, or even if you're not doing that, just generally, if you want to understand what the research in a field is saying, you kind of need to know how to read research. And to read research, it helps to have done research, so you know what's going on. Right. You can see behind the page a little bit as you're reading.
Correct. And just to have to like be forced to read research and have your understanding of said research checked by your advisor and other professors, like to make sure you know what you're doing and not just like completely jacking up your interpretations. Because man, like there's some wild stuff that people come up with that they say is based on science, where it's like, bro, if you actually knew how to read a fucking manuscript, you would realize how dumb this idea is.
Yeah.
And so like, I think a lot of that is coming from people who mean well, but don't have any like graduate training or formal education in the space. And so like their good faith efforts are still terrible efforts.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not one to shill for the ivory tower academic structures, but I think it takes a very unique person to be able to take the purely self-taught approach and navigate it effectively, because as you mentioned, it's not just exposing yourself to the material, but sometimes your genuine best attempt at interpretations are off base.
Yeah.
And when it's entirely self-guided, there's no one there to correct your course.
Correct.
And say, that was a good attempt, but have you considered this different angle at it?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I started grad school thinking I was quite brilliant and came out feeling much dumber. And it was because I received plenty of corrections along the way, but from really smart people who set me on the right course.
Yeah, and I definitely feel like I understand research in general much better now than I did 2 years ago.
Yeah. Another thing that you didn't mention that I'd like to throw in there. So sure. I've been within the university walls for the last 6 years, which means every year there's a new group of undergrads interviewing in our department. And I'll always sit down and they'll say, ask for advice about graduate school and stuff. One thing to keep in mind if you're thinking about pursuing a master's in the field is that the amount of variability between master's programs in our field is enormous in terms of what you're going to get. So there are some master's programs that are super applied. You might even be automatically assigned to work as the strength and conditioning assistant with one of the athletic teams. Mm-hmm. You may never see or even hear about a research project happening in those hallways.
Yeah.
The other side, I think the program we graduated from is the complete opposite, where you can't throw a rock without hitting a different research study. There's 6 labs down the hallway, and they're all working, 12, 14 hours a day around the clock. So many studies going on. But if you went into that master's program and your main goal was to get hands-on experience coaching athletes, you would have come out of that and been probably unpleasantly surprised by the amount of avenues for exposure to athletes.
Yeah, and even within a program like that, the variability in what you will study in your lab that the other students are doing or what your advisor is doing, and also what you will be allowed to do for your own research is also very, very fast.
Great point.
So my advisor is actually he is an exercise oncology guy. And so we had mostly breast cancer research going on in the lab. Had a schizophrenia study we were helping out with. And so the research that I assisted with, that's the type of stuff we were doing. But then me and the other master's student, he gave us the leeway to do projects for our thesis that we actually cared more about. So she looked at the effects of different crank links on different performance and gas exchange variables for cyclists, which has nothing to do with cancer. But Dr. B's super cool and was like, hey, you want to do this? Cool, do it. And I just looked at bench press, which again has nothing to do with cancer, but Dr. B's chill as hell. And so he was like, this is what you want to do? You're passionate about it? Absolutely. Let's do that. And not every advisor will give you that leeway.
Yeah. So, if you're out there searching for a program, obviously, like Greg mentioned, think about, is that something that's going to really be necessary or help you, get closer to what you want? And then really think carefully about what kind of program and kind of who's the right fit for an advisor. And hopefully that's some helpful information out there.
Big piece of advice I would give is if you want to apply to a program, definitely reach out to the advisor first. Make sure that, they know your name. When your application crosses their desk, they'll be like, oh, I've interacted with this person before. They seem decent. and talk to them about how your experience in their lab will be, but don't take that at face value. Also talk to the current graduate students who are in their lab, because some advisors are very forthcoming, very straightforward, and what they tell you about what you can expect from their lab is exactly what you will get from their lab. Sometimes they're somewhat like salespeople, and you'll get kind of a more accurate view of what actually goes on in that lab from the graduate students. So yeah, talk to your prospective advisor, but definitely talk to their current students as well.
Yeah, and as Greg mentioned, maybe think twice about running two businesses while you do your master's.
Yes.
So, Greg is a tremendously humble guy. Once more, I want to congratulate him on finishing his master's and somehow managing to run a couple companies. And you're still married, correct?
I think so.
And maintain a marriage during the whole process. I think that says more about Lindsay than it does about you.
Oh, absolutely. No question.
To close out episode 2, we've got a great interview with Dr. Jason Cholewa, so stay tuned and enjoy. Welcome to the interview portion of today's podcast. This is Eric Trexler, Stronger by Science, Director of Education. Greg is unfortunately not with us today. He is collecting data like every good scientist does. But we are very lucky because today we have Jason Cholewa. He's a professor, associate professor at Coastal Carolina University. You might be saying, who's Jason Cholewa? You do recognize his name. You probably saw it on a paper and thought it was Cholewa. But Jason, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So Jason and I go back. When I was looking at graduate schools, he was one of the people I reached out to. And at the time you were at Kentucky. And so I went out there for the interview process. I was talking to one of the faculty members and they were like, yeah, we know you've been talking a lot with Dr. Cholewa. And I was like, I think you got the wrong guy. I've never met a Cholewa. Like, I was certain that your name was Cholewa. So me and this faculty member were having like parallel conversations and I thought they had me mixed up with a completely different person. So Jason, for people, surely people have seen your work in the peer-reviewed literature. Can you give us a little introduction, kind of what your background is, what you do now?
Of course. Well, how far back do you want me to go?
As far as you'd like. Don't not deepest, darkest secrets, but whatever you want.
Okay. So academically, my undergraduate is actually in communications with a focus on marketing. And I realized pretty early on out of school that I really did not enjoy much that had to do with marketing and sales. And I had always loved training. So I decided to become a personal trainer. And I was very good at training people that were like myself. So if you were a meathead and you wanted to become more of a meathead, I was your guy. But then I got this client who was 80 some odd years old and she had just had a stroke and I felt completely clueless and helpless. And I decided to go back to school to take some classes non-matriculating to learn a little bit more. And much like everything else that happens in my life, I got a little carried away and ended up getting a PhD in applied exercise physiology from Springfield College. So that's kind of the backstory to where I am now. I'm currently an associate professor at Coastal Carolina University, or a small school in South Carolina. And I also do some online coaching in addition to my professorial duties.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of a common thread on our podcast. We tend to bring people on that are their primary appointment is being a meathead, and they kind of moonlight by doing science or, training people. So you did your PhD at Springfield College, and the topic of your dissertation was betaine, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So can you give us a little bit of a background on betaine? Like from me, like I've done a lot of my supplement research on some of the heavy hitters, caffeine, creatine, nitric oxide stuff, the things that are kind of front and center. I feel like betaine has kind of been hanging around the periphery of the supplement world for a while. Can you give us like a brief background about what it is and kind of, I guess it's kind of how it entered the scene?
Betaine is a common name for trimethylglycine. So you have a glycine with 3 methyl groups attached to it. And it was first discovered in beets, and that's where it's got its name. And it's rich in not only beets, but also green leafy vegetables like spinach and kale, and to a lesser extent in wheat, as well as in some shellfish as well. When I was looking for a topic for my dissertation, I knew I wanted to do something with regards to sport supplementation and how it affected strength and body composition. And so I was looking for something novel to study. I kind of wanted to be different and not go the route of some of the compounds that had been more heavily researched. And I saw a couple studies that were done.
So what you're
Go
saying
ahead.
is you wanted your lit review to be very difficult.
Yeah, actually.
That sucks. Sorry. Keep going.
So I saw some studies that were done and in regards to performance. And the first study I found, well, I should back up a second. And when I write my review of literatures, I like to collect all the studies. And before I even read any of them, I like to put them in chronological order to try and better tell the story of whatever I'm doing a lit review on or researching. And so the first study I found was done in polio patients back in the 50s, where it improved some metrics of performance. And then there wasn't really a lot until this study came out in horses that was actually done at UK Veterinary. And then there were some studies in like 2008 or 9 that showed some improvements in performance, albeit they were pretty contradictory. Some showed improvements in power, while others showed improvements in muscular endurance. And the ones that showed benefits on power didn't show muscular endurance, and vice versa. But what really got me interested as I was researching it is I saw all this work that was done in animals, specifically pigs and broiler chickens. And in pigs, they'd been using it for at least a decade as a dietary additive to increase meat yield and reduce subcutaneous fat, which I thought was really interesting. If it's improving body composition in pigs, maybe it can do this in humans. And only one other study had looked at it at the time, and that study had done it in obese individuals who were not exercising. And so most of the studies in pigs were young pigs that the stress of the bones growing put a stress upon the muscles, and that maybe resulted in a little greater adaptation. And then one study I found, and there's a lot of these studies actually coming out of China. They love to research betaine and livestock. And they found that pigs that were given these pens to move around in, kind of free range pigs, I guess, if you will, saw greater improvements in meat yield than pigs that were confined to a very small pen. So that's kind of what gave me the idea to do my dissertation on trimethylglycine or betaine and see how it might impact changes in body composition associated with resistance training.
Yeah, I love this idea. I've never thought of bulking as trying to increase my meat yield. Um, so you want to help these, young college age people increase their meat yield. Had anybody looked at hypertrophy up to that point, or was it all just kind of functional performance outcomes?
It was almost all performance outcomes, physical performance outcomes. There was one study that did measure body composition, that wasn't in the obese subjects, but it was very short in duration. I think it was like 2 weeks in duration, and there was no training component with it. So it was uh, untrained individuals.
Yeah. So okay, so you got this idea. You did your lit review. You say, okay, this might have some benefit for body composition, lean mass, body fat, performance. You had a performance component too, right?
Yeah, 1 RMs and vertical jump, and then tracking the amount of volume that was occurring during training as well.
Okay. So in a nutshell, I mean, what did you end up finding?
We found improvements in lean mass, improvements in reductions in fat mass, and but no real performance benefit. There was a decrease in the vertical jump of the subjects taking the placebo, but there was no increase in the vertical jump of the betaine subjects. We also looked at the lean cross sectional area of the arm and the thigh. And to do that, we did girth measurements and then took skin folds at the quadrants to give an estimation of lean cross sectional area. And so saw a greater increase in lean cross sectional area of the arm than of the thigh. Interestingly, in one of the pig studies I found, they found greater increases in the hams than in the butts in the pigs. So that was an interesting little tidbit to try and present at my defense.
Yeah. So okay, and that was, I mean, what was that, like 2013 ish?
Yeah,
Okay. So what I like to do, we bring on people who do research. You hear every researcher say like, well, one study's just one study. You don't want to make all your conclusions based on one paper. And then with interviews, people are like, spend 45 minutes telling me about one study, please. So as a person who's studied betaine, who's kind of seen the literature evolve, what's your current status in terms of betaine's applications? Like, do you think there's a useful role for it for people that are interested in supplementing to increase muscle, lose fat, enhance performance, maybe?
it's a great question. The We did a study a couple of years ago, and we looked at the interaction between betaine supplementation and resistance training in young women, and we found an increase in a reduction in fat mass compared to placebo, but no real clear improvements in lean mass or rectus femoris muscle thickness compared to placebo, and also no improvements in performance, again measured with 1 RMs and vertical jump. So I think it may have a slight benefit in regards to increases in lean mass, and maybe a slightly greater benefit in regards to reductions in fat mass. And now this is all molecular studies coming from animals, so take it if you will. But in pigs and chickens, betaine suppresses lipogenesis, um, and increases AMPK mRNA expression. So it may help someone to lose fat in that regards, but this hasn't been replicated in humans. Um, so if your goal is to increase your strength, your 1 RM, it's probably not all that helpful.
Yeah.
We're going to look at it hopefully in CrossFit athletes in the fall to see, again, to add more data to the body composition outcomes, but to see if it does improve strength endurance. In terms of muscle mass, it's a really powerful osmolyte. And so to give you an idea, when I was doing my dissertation, I had to capsulate all the all the treatments and all the placebos, I had to make like 9,000 capsules or something ridiculous like that with a little Cap'em quick machine going 50 capsules at a time. And I was doing it, and this was in April in Connecticut, so it's not crazy humid like it is in the Carolinas. But I stepped away, I took a break, and I came back, and there was a little bit of betaine that had spilled, maybe like half the size of a penny on the table. And I came back, and it was just a pool of water. And so
Wow.
I was like, that's interesting. So every time I would make it, I would leave out like a little bit of betaine and come back and see what happened. And every time I came back, it was just water sitting there. So that's probably what's happening within the muscles as well, is that it's drawing water into the muscles, kind of like the same way that creatine volumizes the muscles, and maybe that is beneficial in terms of strength endurance, or in terms of creating a more hospitable environment for protein synthesis. But that's yet to be seen.
So, I mean, currently, do you see betaine being included in a lot of supplement formulas on the market? Like, I don't think I know anyone that specifically uses betaine as a single ingredient, you know? Are you familiar with a lot of people using it, or maybe adding it in like pre-workout formulas or anything?
Yeah, which is interesting. I think Now Food sells a trimethylglycine, and and then there's the Beta Power, which comes from DuPont Nutrition, though I'm not sure if that's available on the retail market or just as a wholesale. But most of the trimethylglycine that I've seen is in pre-workout supplements, which usually the dose is a little bit lower than what we've used in the studies, and also it's not.
Wait. You're telling me that a pre-workout formula is underdosed for something?
Never.
I don't believe it, man. Those formulas that have 60 ingredients and the scoop is like 10 grams of actual weight, I don't believe it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go on. I'm just being a smartass.
No, we can go down that road as well.
But anyway, you were saying you do see betaine in some of these
I see. Yeah, I
multi-ingredients.
see it in the multi-ingredient pre-workout supplements, and there's a gazillion of them on the market. And usually it's not, at least in the doses that we've studied, it's usually about half that dose. And just like beta alanine, which is also usually underdosed in those products, it's a supplement that I don't think acts acutely. I think it's something you need to take for like 2 to 4 weeks and allow it to accumulate in the tissues to exert its effect. Unfortunately, unlike beta alanine, you don't get the paresthesia, so you're probably not going to get the sweet placebo effect.
Yeah. So one time I was in a kind of like an undergraduate lab class. It's weird. I actually told this story last night. I was hanging out with Greg and some friends, but it was like an undergrad research methods class. So we did like a little pretend lab, like just to learn how studies work. And we were trying to figure out, well, what should we do for this little pretend study? And I was pushing really hard, like, let's do a little beta alanine thing. Like, we can get the doses for cheap, and it'd be quick and easy, and we could do a little experiment. And a lot of people were a little hesitant, but just by like sheer force of will, I like insisted that our class was going to do this. The TA actually accidentally gave us, like, I think it was about a 10-gram dose. Like, he had messed up like the size of the scoop. and so every kid in this undergrad class is just like acting like they're wearing a suit made of bees. Like, we're all crawling out of our skin, and everyone's looking at me like, hey, Eric, thanks for thanks for saying we should do this. But in my defense, it could have been worse, because I heard that like a couple years ago, in a similar scenario, they accidentally gave a bunch of students like 30 grams of caffeine. Did you hear about that?
No.
Yeah, I forget where it occurred. I think it was across the Atlantic somewhere. But I forget if they're trying to do a real study or just like a little in-class kind of experiment. But they intended to give 300 milligrams, and they accidentally gave like 30 grams of caffeine. And fortunately, nobody died. But like, I think two of them had to go on dialysis, like very acutely. But yeah, it was, so it could have been worse is the moral of that story.
Wow, 30. I mean, even 3 grams of caffeine is
If if you,
high.
if you have 3 grams, you're gonna have a bad day. If you have 10, you could die. If you have 30, you probably should die. You know what I mean?
Have you ever taken niacin on an empty stomach?
Only in big multi-ingredient formulas where I couldn't really suss out exactly what was the niacin.
Where you didn't get the flush?
Right. It was like the only times I've had niacin, I think they were included in pre-workouts. So I was getting the beta alanine and the caffeine and the niacin. So it's kind of hard to tell what's what. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I I talk about niacin and sport nutrition, and one of my students came back one time the next day and told me he took niacin and said he thought he was going to die because he got this huge niacin flush. And he said it was a combination between like the beta alanine tingling and really bad sunburn. All I could do was laugh.
Yeah. Oh man, yeah. The thing with beta alanine is and niacin, it's like if you don't see it coming and nobody warns you, like yeah, you could take a real heavy scoop and be like, okay, so this is it for me. But now have you done some research on pre-workouts themselves? Because I know you talk about it a lot. I've seen you talk about it at conferences and stuff.
I have this one ongoing project that currently is on hold as they work on our labs. But one of the things with pre workouts and really the entire market of pre workouts and all the research that's been done on pre workouts is they've all been compared to a placebo. And so you have the issue that you alluded to with some of the active ingredients being underdosed. But then you also have a very large dose of caffeine in these products. And caffeine is ergogenic in most instances for most people. And so when you're comparing it to a placebo, it's not really telling you whether that product is any more effective than taking a 15-cent caffeine tablet. And it's not telling you whether any of those other ingredients are acting ergogenically or ergolytically, so actually reducing the effects of caffeine within that product. And so that's something that's kind of been bothering me over the past like 3 or 4 years is all these studies that compare pre-workout to a placebo. And okay, the pre-workout is safe. And another study comes out and comparing another pre-workout to a placebo and looking at heart rate and blood pressure and energy expenditure. And it's not really giving us in the scientific field any information. It's not new. It's not novel. It's not really beneficial. So we're doing a little kind of pet project comparing this one pre-workout supplement against an equal dose of caffeine against a placebo. And the manufacturer was kind enough to get on board with this study and provide us with the pre-workout as well as the caffeine and the placebo to kind of put his product on the line to see if it is any more beneficial.
Yeah, I mean that's gutsy because I've been in when you write about creatine or caffeine or beta alanine, you have to at least address the pre-workout literature. And most of the times I've had to do that in a manuscript. I say, hey, there's this pre-workout stuff, but I don't know. Like there's like 35 ingredients. I can't really make a determination about what's going on there. But that's cool. And it's cool that they're willing to put their product on the line like that. You know what I mean? And say, I think that this combination of ingredients is more than just caffeine.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a smaller brand label. They've only got a few products, but they do a pretty thorough job of kind of vetting what they're putting into it.
Yeah. I remember back in the day, it was like a thing where people that were into supplements were getting their own caffeine powder, just like pure powder. I don't know if you could still do that. Because I know people have overdosed on it and died, unfortunately.
I'm
Um,
not sure. We have the pure caffeine powder and a digital scale, and when the person who's blind or who's running the blind of the study, so I don't know what people are drinking and they don't know what they're drinking. It's a double blind study, but when she puts together the treatments, she wears a little like nurse's mask when she's dealing with the caffeine.
yeah, I used to always, it would just shock me when as a teenager, I'd spend so much money on pre-workouts. And then one time I was like, oh, I'm going to get some caffeine powder, which I don't recommend, by the way. If you don't know what you're doing, don't touch pure caffeine powder. Okay. Like for real, like people get it mixed up with their creatine, and a creatine sized dose of caffeine powder will mess you up. So don't do it. However, I did it. And it was just incredible. Like you could get like a lifetime supply of caffeine for like $30. Like you would never see the end of that supply of caffeine when you get it in powder form. But again, that's not an endorsement. So this, you're talking about blinding and stuff, and different experimental protocols. That kind of segues nicely. You guys recently had a poster and a manuscript that came out about statistical reporting and exercise science. Can you tell me and the listeners a little bit about that project?
Well, it was Conrad Ernest's brainchild. I don't want to take too much credit for it. It was his idea and something that he had been noticing. And when you look at the peer review process for publishing any manuscript, at least in our field, I can't speak to fields outside of exercise science and sport nutrition, but they're pretty vague. There's really not. Each journal doesn't have instructions as far as what to look for. Um, in terms of evaluating the statistics of the whether it was appropriate or not. It's kind of left to each editor and each reviewer. So there's a high level of autonomy, which can be both a good and a bad thing. But essentially, what we noticed was a lot of the stats were being reported incorrectly. So generally, when you report statistics, when you report like characteristics, you report the mean and the standard deviation. And when you report change variables, you report confidence intervals associated with them. And what we found was people were reporting the mean and they were reporting the standard error, which is not the correct variance statistic to use. It very much underestimates or gives an impression of a much lower uh, variance in the data collected.
Yeah, if the reader's not paying attention, they might interpret it as a standard deviation, and it would look like a very small standard deviation.
Exactly. We were finding some papers that reported uh, no variance statistic at all. A lot of papers weren't reporting effect sizes or weren't reporting the correct effect sizes. A lot of papers were not putting forth a primary hypothesis or any directed hypothesis at all. The other thing we found was there really wasn't any difference between what you would consider a high tier journal in our field and more of it's called like an entry level journal
Yeah.
in terms of these errors in statistical reporting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've always been really interested in stats, and my disclaimer is interested does not mean good. Like I don't claim to be an expert statistician. I just think they're important. And I think the more a researcher expands that skill set, the more effective they can be. So these types of papers are remarkably helpful. Um, What do you think is the root cause of this? Why is statistical reporting not more universally understood, and why are the guidelines not kind of streamlined and standardized?
I'm not totally sure, to be honest. It's curious why more journals haven't adopted the consort paper, which kind of lays out how you should report your statistics. Um, some of the journals we submitted this paper to, actually, quite a few rejected our paper and said it doesn't apply to us or whatever. So I'm not sure why.
Were they correct?
No, they
I
were.
knew it.
They had, we had scrubbed their data, and this was just for 1 year. This was just for the 2017 calendar year. So
Yeah.
we had scrubbed many different databases or many different journals and just went through one at a time. And we were only focused on sport nutrition trials. So anything that had some sort of performance or body composition outcome related to sport nutrition or sport supplementation.
Yeah.
Um,
So basically, the journal didn't want to publish a thing saying that they looked kind of bad,
yeah, I guess so.
or maybe they genuinely didn't have an interest. To be fair.
It could be, absolutely.
So one of the things that's tricky, my girlfriend is doing her PhD in psychology, and psychology is a field that has very much embraced quantitative sciences. So her department has a whole branch of people that are just quantitative psychologists. Like, they develop new ways to do stats. And I think one of the things that encourages that is that they have sample sizes to play around with. So in the sport nutrition exercise science literature, a lot of times you have studies that are remarkably low in sample size. And so if you have a small sample size, you can have the most expansive statistical skill set in the world, but you can't use any of it. You know what I mean? Like, there's not enough statistical power to actually implement some of these more sophisticated stats. And I have a theory that that's one of the reasons that the education that an exercise science student receives in statistics is generally not that great. I think as a field from the top down, we've never really gotten that into it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally agree. Just looking at my own personal education and in doctoral statistics, it's interesting that you say that too, because I'm reading this book right now called The Undoing Project, and it's related to some psychologists back in the 70s, some Israeli psychologists, and kind of tearing apart at these different theories they had back then and how it really was the Wild West. Um, but yeah, a lot of the studies are either underpowered or have a very low sample size, and so you are really limited in what kind of statistics that you can run. There's also not quite as much modeling that's happening, I think, in sport and exercise science as there are in psychology.
I mean, yeah, it's the thing that I found is a lot of exercise science programs at the graduate level don't really have a lot of really high level stat courses within department. And if you want those, you often have to go out of department. And one of the issues is that you might be learning stats that, because they're teaching mostly to students kind of within their wheelhouse, it's not super applicable, So like, if you, I remember one of the stat courses I took was quite good, but start to finish a full year of coursework, we never got to repeated measures analysis. So basically, the entire spectrum of what was learned only applied to independent groups' study designs. We don't really have a ton of pure independent group study designs with no repeated measures in sport nutrition exercise science. So it's tricky. I think sports science benefits from papers like yours that say, hey, we have a standardization problem. And sports science benefits from papers like the big paper that came out with Stork about kind of improving transparency and methodology in sports science. I know like Andrew Vygotsky was pushing that hard, and I think Greg was part of that as well. But I mean, these are good things. These are not catastrophic, the sky is falling things of like, oh, the field's in shambles. These are good things. They're people proactively saying, hey, let's try to standardize some things so that we're all speaking the same language, and let's make sure that our language is actually valid.
Yeah, I agree. Challenge will create positive adaptation, and that's certainly something that we need in our field. I have my students do an article review as part of sport nutrition in relation to they each select a dietary supplement, and because none of them know the difference between a peer-reviewed article and a block, and furthermore, none of them can really know the difference between like a systematic review or a meta-analysis and some sort of clinical trial or trial. I have them clear the articles with me first, and I give them a little bit of feedback on it, on how to understand it. And so there is such a huge, just wide range of methodology that I see in terms of complete reporting of the methodology versus leaving a lot out and a lot of questions, especially in some of these journals that aren't indexed in PubMed that they somehow find articles from.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting time. I used to do a similar exercise with my students, but it was not an exercise science course. So I'd let them pick paper from whatever field they wanted. And the range of methodologies is obviously expected to be broad, but even just there are certain fields that if you aren't fully conformed to their agreed upon standardized methods in reporting, not a chance. It's just not going to get through. In some fields, I'm very close friends with somebody who's a statistician who has worked in multiple fields. He's a pure stat guy. So whoever hires him, that's the field he's in. And he said a similar thing happened in the field of nursing research. He was involved with it, I think, for at least a couple decades. And he said, from when I started, the analytical approaches, the methodological reporting, it was just a night and day difference from the time I entered the field to the time that I moved on. So fields grow up at different rates. And I think exercise science is at kind of right at the start of a very positive growing phase. And it kind of coincides with a more global thing, right? Like I just saw the University of California system failed to renew their journal subscription to Elsevier. There's all these big rumblings of change when it comes to the publishing process, how universities do academics, how much people will start transitioning toward maybe online educations, and how do we deal with the costs and the return on investment of higher education? Like, I feel like there's a lot of things that are kind of converging right now when it comes to science and education. My question to you, as somebody who's in higher education, where's all this going? Do you have any positive or dire predictions for the near future?
I don't know about predictions, but I've definitely made some observations that seem to be pretty backed up by more experts in regards to analyzing higher education. And so I think the return on investment is a really, really good question. We currently live in a society where it's kind of viewed that college and a college education is the answer to all of our economic woes and economic discrepancies, or inequalities. And I'm not sure if that's the answer. And I'm not sure if that is true, especially not for everyone. It seems like college for the students is a thing that they have to do, that they feel is, the first step in their life that is kind of pre-scripted, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like the 13th grade, right? You finish 12th grade in high school and you go to 13th grade. It's just what you do.
That's kind of what it seems like, and a lot of them don't really have any passion in anything that they're studying. Um, I would say at Coastal that 50% of our exercise science students don't even exercise. Not they don't train, not they're not competing, but they don't even exercise. And so
So
trying
the
to
degree is kind of a means to an end because it knocks out a bunch of useful prerequisites, basically.
something like that, yeah. Um, and as you're aware, the costs of college have gone way up, and I can assure you, it's not because faculty are getting paid more. Um,
Yeah.
Much like everywhere else in education, we're asked to do more with less. But the amenities of all these schools is really what is driving up this cost of higher education. So, and I hate to sound like a salty old man, but I remember in undergrad, we had a very small dorm room with two beds in it that we could either bunk or have separate, and that was how we lived. And now the dorm rooms are becoming much more luxurious. A lot of times you have apartment styles where uh, you don't have to share a room. Um, Coastal has essentially subbed out most of their living to contractors, and so they have pools and tiki bars, and it's outrageous.
It's like a
I
college
don't want to.
resort.
It really is, and I don't want to just pick on my institution because it's everywhere. LSU just put in a lazy river in the shape of LSU that cost them millions of dollars. Like,
Oh
so
man.
all these colleges are competing to get more students, and one of the ways they're doing it is by offering more amenities. And we're not just talking about physical amenities like this, but non-academic departments, and then all the administrators that have to run all those departments, and then all the insurance and stuff that goes into it as well. So all of that's driving up the cost, and it's probably not going to change until students and parents start realizing that's really what they're paying for, and demanding a different model. Um, a lot very well could go to online education. It's a lot cheaper to offer a course online than a brick and mortar course. Um, kind of getting sidetracked off this, but probably most of the students in college don't need to go to college, and could do something else that they find interesting. I love education. I think education is important to provide people with the thinking skills and the knowledge to better interpret the world, but I don't know if the cost is going to justify it all, and I don't know when that tipping point is going to be.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting question. You bring up the idea of a new model, and I feel like it's analogous when it comes to higher education and academic publishing, is that we are locked into models that were established a very long time ago. And they've always been how publishing or higher education works. Like, this is the system. And what we're finding is that we might not necessarily need those systems to be the way they always have been. So things like online education, online open access publishing that doesn't require the costs of printing. We're seeing that technology is kind of forcing us to encounter these decisions where we're kind of locked into these systems. But if we made the system today, would we design it the same way? And if the answer is no, then that probably means we could make some useful revisions, you know?
Yeah. When was the last time you picked up a printed journal? Like not printed an article that you downloaded online to highlight and write on, but actually like a periodical.
Right. Yeah, no, it happened. I was cleaning out my office after I graduated and there were some dusty old rags in the way. It was it was like an MSSE copy from like the mid 1990s when I was like 4 years old. But no, by the time I got into the world of caring about journals, that was already done. Like that was I've never actually gone to a librarian or a friend or a mentor and said, do you happen to have a hard copy of this journal laying around? It's never happened in my life.
Yeah, everything is online, which is great. And there's more and more and more publishers, and it seems I don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg. Um, the pressure to publish more frequently and higher volumes, and then more publishers and going back and forth. But I just wonder, some of the real seminal scientists, maybe some like physicists, how how many publications do they have on their Vita? Like some of the people that we really think about in physics, obviously Einstein is one, but Watt and all those people, and then in exercise science, Karpovich and some of the people from Auburn, way back in the day. How many publications do they have that are really impactful and really meaningful compared to the desire today to just really build up your CV with publications, when some of these studies are, in my opinion, kind of rushed to get enough subjects to publish rather than to get enough subjects to really seek out the truth.
Yeah. No, I mean, there are plenty of fields where people have won Nobel prizes with less than 10 or 20 publications, you know? Um, and you're right. The question is, are you doing research to publish or to answer questions? You know, I know that Greg often talks about the idea of imposing a limit, you know, the idea that if you're a university professor, you're only allowed to be involved with 2 published papers per calendar year. And if we imposed a limit like that, how much? So instead of chasing more, people would be saying, I only have 2 publications to work with. These things have to be phenomenal if I want to get tenure. You know what I mean? So it's almost shifting the focus of, instead of how much more can I do, how much better can I do with a fixed amount of publications? Um, I don't know how that would work. There's upsides and downsides, but as a general statement, you know, we've talked a little bit about current issues in science and publishing and higher ed. Now I'm about to be 28, and I spent the last 10 years in the university setting. So obviously, I support higher education and research and science and the publication process. But we should always be open to making processes better. You know what I mean? So I've had the absolute best times of my life working on research, publishing papers, being in the university system. I've had basically most of my life within those systems and processes. But it's always interesting to revisit how we do things and how we might do them better.
Yeah, I agree. I think just being in academia and on the other side of the desk, and maybe this is holds true in publishing as well, but it seems that we keep taking this the consumer is always right, and this consumer model to higher education. And what is the I think in our country especially, because there are so many universities, we really need to. It's a philosophical question. What is the role of higher education and institutions of higher learning in modern society? Is it to prepare young people for economic production and economic independence, uh, or is it to seek the truth? Um, and I think once we can answer that question, we can maybe refine the institutions of higher education, how they're set up, and how learning takes place. But until we stop viewing students as consumers and once again view them as students.
Pupils, trainees.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Well, Greg is going to be super pissed that he missed this discussion. This is like his favorite thing to talk about. But I'll deal with the ramifications of that. So today, I don't know when this episode goes up. Today's March 25th, 2019. So let's pencil in March 25th, 2029. Why don't you come back on and we'll see if you fixed all these issues in higher education.
I might not have a job if I try to.
Fair enough.
We can really push the protections of tenure.
Yeah, that's what they're there for. I believe in you. Okay, so one question I want to ask before we go. We're really thankful for your time. It's been awesome to chat. I love having you on, and hopefully we'll have you on again. One thing we like to ask people, we bring on all these evidence-based people that are interested in fitness, interested in science. But a lot of people have like a thing or two that they do that isn't necessarily evidence-based. So either they do it themselves or with their clients or something, but something that either kind of flies in the face of the current evidence or there's just no evidence supporting yet. Is there anything that you do or that you have clients do that kind of fits that bill?
No, I can't really think of anything that that we've done. Actually, yeah, I'll give you one example, and I don't know if it flies in the face of evidence or if it isn't evidence based. But I had an athlete just compete in in the bikini division, and we did cryotherapy a couple days before her position or her competition, excuse me, on her lower body to see if we could draw out some additional fluid and inflammation to leave her legs and her lower body a little more defined. Whether it worked or not, I honestly don't know. I don't think it had any negative impacts.
Yeah. Were you pushing that or was the client pushing that?
She had actually asked about it. And so I gave it some thought, and I thought that might have been the best time to use it because icing, ice baths, things like that tend to at least blunt some of the molecular indicators of adaptation to resistance training. Uh, so I didn't want to do it during the off season or during much of the competition phase where the inflammation, the little bit of inflammation and debris and everything kind of signal for adaptation. But I thought maybe it would be beneficial if we did it right before the show, if we could cut down any lingering inflammation. I mean, obviously we deloaded and tapered leading up to the show, but see if we could cut down any sort of lingering inflammation to leave a more harder defined look, especially in the lower body.
Yeah. And so your interpretation was either a neutral to a slight positive benefit?
Yeah, she definitely looked better than came in a lot better shape than the previous year. A lot more defined, and whether there's so many factors that could play a role in that. Part of it was just overall better conditioning and a lower body fat percentage, lower body fat. But whether it helped or not, I'm not sure. Anecdotally, you feel a little bit better the next day. You feel a little less sore after sitting in an ice bath. So maybe it was mental.
Yeah, could be. Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely something there's certain questions with physique athletes I don't know if we'll ever have an answer to. How do you who's going to run that study to say, oh yeah, if you do a little cryotherapy a couple days before, you look subjectively leaner. I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about. Some of those things that kind of fit into the periphery of, it's not necessarily evidence-based, but hey, here's a thing that some people do. But today was great. So we talked about betaine. We talked about kind of the state of science and academic publishing and higher education. And ultimately, I think we're at kind of a starting point of a lot of growth and maturation. And I think it's all positive growth. And it's good knowing that people like you, Jason, are in these academic structures and promoting these positive changes. So thank you for what you do for sports science, for higher education, and thank you for coming on and sharing your time with us.
It was a blast. I appreciate you having me on. I'd love to come back sometime.
Absolutely. Greg's going to be so upset he missed this, so he'll probably schedule a impromptu part 2 at some point.
That'd be awesome.
All right. Take care.
All right.
Thanks for listening to the Stronger by Science podcast. Now, Greg and I are not experts in medicine or health or really anything else for that matter. So before you make any changes to your diet and exercise habits, make sure you check with a doctor or another healthcare professional. If you enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to support it, visit strongerbyscience.com to check out the products and services that we offer. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.